The slap came before the thunder. Not just loud but final. The sharp crack of my mother's palm across my face echoed through the grand library of Old Oak Manor, louder than the storm rolling across the grounds of the estate outside. For a split second everything froze. The lightning beyond the tall Gothic windows illuminated the room, catching the polished mahogany table, the shelves of unread books, and the faces of the people who had already decided my fate. It wasn't the pain that stunned me. It was the certainty behind it. The entitlement. The confidence of a woman who truly believed she was allowed to hurt me because I had always belonged beneath her. Sign the deed, Evelyn. My sister Clara's voice cut through the silence like a blade wrapped in silk. She slid a gold-plated pen across the table toward me, slow and deliberate, as if the outcome were inevitable. You were always the help. You don't deserve the crown. I tasted blood where my teeth had cut into my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I didn't look at her. Instead, I looked toward the end of the table, where Mr. Sterling sat, the family's attorney, a man who had spoken very little during the last hour, his presence heavy, his eyes observant. When he finally leaned forward, the air in the room seemed to harden. Do you know who actually? He stopped himself. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The silence that followed felt unnatural, as if the room itself was holding its breath. And in that moment something crystallized inside me, a realization so sharp it almost hurt more than the slap. For 24 years, I had been the only person in that room living in the truth. I just hadn't known it yet. To understand that slap, you have to understand the years that came before it. I grew up in Old Oak Manor, a sprawling Gothic estate built of marble, ironwork, and secrets that never left the walls. To the outside world, we were the Blackwells, a powerful family, industrial royalty, heirs to a shipping empire that spanned continents and generations. We were photographed at charity galas, quoted in business magazines, and whispered about with admiration. Inside those walls I was invisible. My sister Clara was everything I wasn't. Loud, beautiful, radiant, cruel in a way that never left bruises where people could see them. She laughed easily and cut deeply. And my mother Beatrice adored her. Clara was the child she wanted, the legacy she showed off, the one she paraded through Paris and Milan while I stayed behind, learning how to make myself smaller. My father, Arthur Blackwell, was different. He wasn't perfect, but he was kind. And when his mind began to slip into the slow fog of dementia, kindness became his most fragile possession. While Clara and my mother traveled the Mediterranean finding themselves, I stayed. I was 22 years old and suddenly everything at once. Nurse, accountant, administrator, daughter, stranger. I learned how to manage medications, how to read financial statements, how to soothe a man who woke up every morning terrified because the world no longer made sense. I changed linens. I balanced payroll. I read him the Wall Street Journal long after he could no longer see the words, just to hear a familiar rhythm. I held his hand while he cried for memories that slipped through his fingers like sand. My mother called once a month. Not to ask how he was doing. Not to ask if I was eating. She called to complain that her wire transfer was late. 24 hours late. As if the delay were a personal insult. When my father finally passed 3 weeks ago, I didn't even have time to grieve. The tears weren't dry on my face before they arrived. They didn't come to mourn. They came to harvest. They walked into the manor and wrinkled their noses at the smell of sickness. They talked about renovations while his room was still untouched. Clara began tagging furniture with bright post-it notes, already planning auctions and private sales. The estate was worth $9.7 million. The house, the land, the offshore accounts. It was the prize they had been waiting for. But there was a problem. A legal one. 6 months before his death, my father had quietly updated the deed. For reasons no one could explain, the state required my signature for any transfer of title. And that detail brought us all to this night. This gathering. This confrontation. The vulture's picnic. We sat in the grand library, surrounded by thousands of books my mother had never read. Expensive lilies filled the room, their sweetness clashing with the rot of greed beneath it. Clara sat across from me in a black silk dress that cost more than my entire college education. She tapped her manicured nails against the table, bored, impatient, confident. "Look, Evelyn," she said softly, falsely. You're not built for this. You like your gardens, your quiet little life. Running an estate like this requires sophistication. Just sign it over to me. I'll give you a monthly stipend. A stipend? The word burned. I've been running this house for 3 years, I said quietly. I managed Dad's care, the staff, the audits. My mother slammed her wine glass down. Don't you dare use that tone. You were a caretaker. A glorified maid. Your father was senile when he gave you authority. Then I said the word that changed everything. No. Small. Calm. Final. And that was when my mother stood up and slapped me. And that was when Mr. Sterling finally spoke. And that was the moment everything they thought they owned began to collapse. But what Mr. Sterling revealed next wasn't just a secret about the estate. It was a truth about my birth, my mother, and a fortune that had never belonged to them at all. The silence after Mr. Sterling's unfinished sentence pressed against my ears until it almost hurt. My mother's hand was still trembling in the air, as if she hadn't quite realized what she'd done. Clara leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her confidence unshaken. She had no doubt this would end the way it always did, with me folding, apologizing, and cleaning up the mess. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses slowly. He had the patience of a man who knew time was on his side. Before anyone signs anything, he said evenly, there are facts that need to be acknowledged. Facts that were deliberately kept quiet. My mother scoffed. This is ridiculous. We're wasting time. Evelyn is emotional. She's grieving. I am, I replied. But I'm not confused. Clara's lips curled into a smile. You always were dramatic. Just sign the deed and we can all move on. Mr. Sterling didn't look at her. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin, yellowed folder, the corners soft with age. The sight of it made something in my mother's face flicker. Not fear. Not yet. Something closer to calculation. This document, Sterling said, placing it carefully on the table, dates back nearly 3 decades. Before Clara. Before this house. Before the life you're all claiming. What is that? Clara snapped. Proof, he replied. He opened the folder and slid a single page forward. I couldn't see the text from where I sat, but I watched my mother's face drain of color as soon as she recognized it. The confident posture she'd worn all evening faltered, just for a moment. It was the first crack I'd ever seen. Our grandfather built the company, Clara said quickly, too quickly. Everyone knows that. This is family money. Sterling shook his head. The company your grandfather ran went bankrupt in 1994. Public record. What rebuilt the Blackwell fortune came later. Quietly. Through a private trust. My heart began to pound. I didn't know why yet, but every instinct in me said this wasn't just about money. A trust established by Arthur Blackwell's first wife, Sterling continued. Long before Beatrice entered the picture. The room tilted. My breath caught. First wife. I had been told my biological mother was a penniless orphan. A tragic story. A woman who died in childbirth and left nothing behind except a burden no one wanted. That was the version I grew up with. That was the lie that shaped my place in this family. My mother stood abruptly. That's enough, she said sharply. You're overstepping. Sterling didn't move. The trust included a clause. A very specific one. The assets could only be inherited by her direct bloodline. Clara laughed, but the sound was hollow. So what? That doesn't change anything. It changes everything, Sterling replied. Because Beatrice was never an owner. She was a beneficiary by marriage. And that marriage ended the moment Arthur passed. I felt dizzy. The room seemed too small. The walls pressing in as years of memory rearranged themselves in my mind. The way my mother never touched me unless it was necessary. The way Clara was always introduced as the future. The way I was always an afterthought. The deed, Sterling said, turning toward me now, was never meant to be signed over. It was already yours. The words landed slowly, like stones dropping into water. What? I whispered. The estate, he said gently. The accounts. The land. They transferred to you the day you turned 21. The only reason this meeting is happening now is because full control activated after Arthur's death. Clara stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. That's a lie. She's manipulating you. Sterling met her glare without flinching. It's all documented. Filed. Legal. Your father kept it quiet to protect Evelyn from exactly this scenario. I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. For the first time in my life she looked small. So all this time, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. You knew. She didn't answer. The power in the room shifted, tangible and electric. I could feel it settling into my bones, unfamiliar but undeniable. But ownership wasn't the end of the story. What I chose to do with that power would decide whether this night ended in forgiveness or something far colder. For a long moment no one spoke. The grandfather clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second sounding like a countdown. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself to survive in this house, and now the silence felt different. It wasn't suffocating anymore. It was waiting. My mother finally broke it. Evelyn, she said softly, her tone suddenly fragile, almost tender. You don't understand how complicated these things are. I let out a slow breath. I understand perfectly, I replied. I understand why you kept me small. Why you let me believe I was lucky just to be here. Clara shook her head, pacing now. This is insane. You can't seriously believe you're capable of running all of this. You barely speak at family dinners. I met her eyes. Because every time I did, you spoke over me. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. Legally speaking, the situation is very simple. Evelyn is the sole owner of the estate, and the primary trustee of all associated accounts. My mother's composure cracked. And what does that mean for us? She asked, her voice tight. It means, Sterling said evenly, that your residency here is at Evelyn's discretion. The word discretion echoed in my head. I thought of the nights I slept on a narrow cot outside my father's room so I could hear if he called out. The mornings I scrubbed the marble floors while Clara posted photos from yachts and beaches. The slap burned again on my cheek, but this time it didn't hurt. It reminded me. You wouldn't, Clara said, stopping in front of me. You don't have the spine. I stood up. My legs were steady. That surprised me the most. You're right, I said calmly. I don't have your kind of spine. I don't crush people for sport. But I do finish what I start. My mother's eyes filled with tears. We're family, she whispered. You wouldn't put us out. I tilted my head. You taught me that family is conditional. Mr. Sterling spoke again. If Evelyn chooses, she can revoke access to all trust-funded assets immediately. Clara's face went pale. You're bluffing. I shook my head. No. I'm deciding. I walked to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked grounds. This house had been my cage and my refuge all at once. I turned back to them. You have 24 hours, I said. Pack what belongs to you personally. Everything else stays. My mother gasped. You can't be serious. I am. Clara's voice rose to a shriek. Where are we supposed to go? I met her glare without flinching. You'll figure it out. You always do. I saw it then. Fear. Real fear. Not of losing comfort but of losing control. The roles had reversed and they knew it. Mr. Sterling closed his briefcase. I'll handle the paperwork, he said quietly. As he left, my mother collapsed into a chair, shaking. Clara stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. I wasn't a stranger. I was the truth they'd ignored. And now they had one night left under my roof. But the next morning would reveal just how far desperation can push people when their power is gone. I barely slept that night. Not because I was afraid but because my mind wouldn't slow down. Every memory I had buried under obedience came back sharp and clear. The whispers behind closed doors. The way Clara learned early that cruelty was currency. The way my mother mastered silence when it served her. At dawn the house felt different. Lighter. As if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I made coffee in the kitchen, the same one I had cleaned every morning for years, and waited. The first sound came around 8. Raised voices. Clara, pacing the hallway, phone pressed to her ear. I don't care if he's in Milan, she snapped. Tell him to call me back. She hung up and threw the phone onto the sofa when she saw me. You planned this, she accused. You waited until Dad died. I took a sip of coffee. I waited until I understood the truth. She scoffed. You think this ends well for you? People will talk. Society will choose us. I finally looked at her fully. Society already knows. Mr. Sterling made sure of that. Her mouth opened then closed. Panic flickered. My mother appeared next, dragging a suitcase that looked far too heavy for her. She paused when she saw me. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "we can still fix this." I didn't respond. She stepped closer. "You don't want this reputation. Throwing out your own mother." I set the mug down. "You threw me out long before today. You just never asked me to leave." Her face twisted. "You're enjoying this." I shook my head. "No. I'm ending it." Movers arrived by mid-morning. Efficient. Silent. They followed my instructions exactly. Only personal items. No antiques. No artwork. No heirlooms. Clara protested loudly when they refused to take the grand piano. "That was promised to me," she screamed. "It belongs to the estate," one mover replied flatly. I watched from the staircase as reality settled in. Credit cards declined. Chauffeurs stopped answering calls. Friends suddenly unavailable. By noon, Clara's rage turned frantic. "You can't freeze everything," she said. "I need access." "You had access for 20 years, I replied. "I needed dignity." She looked at me with hatred. "You were nothing without us." I stepped closer. And yet here I am. My mother sat quietly near the door, staring at the floor. The woman who once ruled every room now looked small, broken. When the last suitcase was loaded, the house fell silent again. Clara hesitated at the door. "You'll regret this." I met her eyes. I already survived worse. The door closed behind them with a sound so final it echoed through the manor. I didn't cry. I walked into my father's study and sat at his desk for the first time. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust that had been disturbed for years. For the first time, the house wasn't haunted. It was mine. But peace never lasts long when people like my mother and sister believe humiliation is temporary and revenge is owed. The days that followed were unnervingly quiet. Not the empty kind of quiet that echoes with loneliness, but a deliberate silence, like the pause after a storm when the air hasn't decided what comes next. I woke early, walked the grounds, and began opening rooms I had avoided for years. Rooms that had always felt forbidden even though I lived there. In my father's study, I found ledgers neatly stacked and labeled in his careful handwriting. He had known. Somewhere deep down he had known this moment would come. That realization hurt more than the slap ever did. He hadn't been weak. He had been careful. Mr. Sterling came by on the third day. We sat at the same mahogany table where my life had shifted. "You did well," he said, not as a lawyer but as a witness. "Most people crumble when power lands in their hands so suddenly." "I don't feel powerful," I replied. "I feel responsible." He nodded. "That's why you'll be fine." We went over details. Asset restructuring, staff contracts, security updates. He paused when we reached the section labeled contingencies. "You should know," he said carefully. "Your mother has already contacted 2 attorneys." I expected the sting of fear. It didn't come. "Let them," I said. He studied me for a moment, then smiled faintly. "That's the correct response." After he left, I received my first call from Clara. I didn't answer. The second came an hour later. Then messages. Voicemails layered with rage, then bargaining, then something almost resembling apology. By evening the tone shifted. "You think this is over," her last message said. "It's not." I stood by the window, phone in hand, watching the sky darken over Old Oak Manor. For the first time I understood something important. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just stands still and lets others exhaust themselves against it. The next morning the staff approached me hesitantly. People who had once barely met my eyes now waited for instruction. "We're here for you, Miss Evelyn," the head housekeeper said. I swallowed. "Thank you. Nothing changes today. We take care of the house. That's all." Later that afternoon, I found an envelope slipped under the front door. No return address. Inside was a single photocopied document and a handwritten note. "You forgot one thing." The document was a partial financial report. Old. Incomplete. But intentional. My heart slowed as I scanned it. It was proof that Clara hadn't been acting alone. My mother's signature was there too. I sat down hard on the steps, the weight of the truth settling in. This wasn't just greed. It was a plan. A long one. And they weren't finished. Because the document in my hands wasn't a threat. It was an invitation to a final confrontation they thought I wasn't ready for. I read the document again, slower this time. Dates. Amounts. Transfers routed through shell accounts I recognized because I had balanced them myself years ago, back when I thought I was helping the family. My hands didn't shake. That frightened me more than anger ever could. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had used me. I placed the paper on my father's desk and stared at the photograph beside it. He was younger there, arm around a woman I barely remembered. My biological mother. Her smile was soft, unguarded. Nothing like the smiles I'd grown up with. "So this is what you were protecting me from," I whispered. By evening my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Clara. It was my mother. I let it ring until the last second before answering. "Yes." Her voice came through thin and careful. "Evelyn, we need to talk." "We already did," I replied. "No," she said quickly. "Not like this. There are things you don't understand." I glanced at the document. "I understand plenty." A pause. Then, "Where did you get that?" I almost smiled. "You'd be surprised how much people confess when they think you're still invisible." Her breathing grew uneven. "That paperwork is meaningless out of context." "Then explain the context," I said calmly. She tried. She really did. She spoke of pressure, of maintaining appearances, of Clara's ambitions, of how it was all supposed to be temporary. And where was I in that plan? I asked. Silence. "You were resilient," she finally said. "We knew you'd survive." The cruelty of it landed cleanly. Not loud. Not sharp. Just absolute. "I'm meeting with Sterling tomorrow," I said. "If there's anything else you want to explain, you can do it through your lawyer." Her voice broke. "You're destroying this family." I ended the call. The next morning Mr. Sterling confirmed what I already knew. The document was enough to trigger a full forensic audit. Enough to expose everything. Enough to end reputations, not just allowances. "You don't have to proceed," he said. "You already won." I looked out the window at the long drive leading up to the manor. I didn't win. I woke up. That afternoon, the security team informed me that Clara had been seen near the property line. Watching. Waiting. I wasn't afraid. I was ready. Because the truth they buried for decades was finally breathing. And once it started moving, it wouldn't stop. And when Clara decided to stop hiding and confront me directly, I realized this was never just about money. It was about control, and she wasn't ready to lose it. Clara came back 3 days later. Not in the middle of the night like I expected, but in broad daylight, as if confidence could be borrowed just by showing up unannounced. The security team alerted me before she reached the front door. "Let her in," I said. They hesitated. "Are you sure, Miss Evelyn?" "Yes." She stood in the entryway when I arrived, dressed sharply, posture rigid, the same armor she had always worn when she felt cornered. Her eyes scanned the space, taking in what she no longer owned. "So," she said lightly, "you're really doing this?" "I already did," I replied. She laughed, but it cracked halfway through. "You think some old papers give you power? This world doesn't work like that." I gestured toward the sitting room. "Sit." She didn't. "Mother is falling apart," she snapped. "She's sick. You're enjoying that too." I held her gaze. "You didn't worry about her health when you were siphoning money." Her jaw tightened. "That audit you started," she said. "Call it off." "No. You don't understand what you're unleashing." "I do," I said quietly. "I've lived under it my whole life." She stepped closer. "We can make a deal. You keep the house. The main accounts. We just need enough to disappear quietly." I almost felt sorry for her then. Almost. "You taught me something," I said. "That deals made under threat aren't deals. They're traps." Her expression hardened. "You're going to regret this." I nodded once. I already calculated the cost. She left without another word, heels striking marble like gunshots. I watched from the window as her car disappeared down the drive. That evening Mr. Sterling called. "She contacted me," he said. tried to negotiate. And I asked. I declined on your behalf. Good. There was a pause. Evelyn, this will escalate. I know. After the call, I walked through the manor slowly. Every room felt different now, not because of ownership but because of truth. I stopped in the hallway where my mother once scolded me for laughing too loudly. I stood in the kitchen where Clara told me I was lucky to eat at all. Their voices were gone. Later that night, an email arrived. Anonymous. Short. You think exposure protects you. Doesn't. I deleted it. Because fear had always been their language and I no longer spoke it. But when the audit results finally came back, they revealed something even Clara hadn't anticipated. And it changed everything. The next morning, the forensic audit report arrived. Mr. Sterling handed me the thick folder with a quiet look of admiration. I didn't open it immediately. I stood by the window, listening to the rain tapping against the roof, thinking about the last 24 hours of silence. Finally, I sat at the grand library table and opened the folder. Each page confirmed everything I already knew, and more. Every transaction Clara and Mother had made to manipulate finances, hide assets, and obscure ownership was documented in black and white. There was no room to argue, no way to twist the numbers. The truth was laid bare, and it was devastating. Called Clara first. The audit is complete, I said calmly. What? She hissed. You how? I'm not asking for your explanation. I'm giving you the results. Everything is documented. Her voice cracked. This can't be real. It is, I replied. Every offshore account, every embezzled fund, every alteration, it's all here. And the authorities have been notified. They'll decide the consequences. There was silence on the line. I could almost hear her pulse racing. You can't do this, she whispered finally. I already did, I said. The estate, the property, the trust. You own nothing outside your personal belongings. The law is clear. The money you thought was yours is being frozen until the proper redistribution can be completed. She hung up before I could respond. I placed the phone down and exhaled. It was over. Not the storm, not the tension, but the injustice. I had spent my life serving, being invisible, being underestimated. Now the world knew what had been hidden, and I was no longer the shadow. That evening, my mother appeared at the front door. Her posture was stiff, her face pale. Evelyn, she said softly, we need to talk. I didn't answer immediately. I waited until she stepped inside. She looked around at the house she had tried to control, now entirely under my authority. You've changed things, she murmured. I've returned what was always mine, I said. And what's yours? Well, it's limited. She lowered her eyes. I thought you'd never leave me alone, I interrupted. But here we are. She nodded slowly, finally understanding the weight of her choices. The dynamic had shifted. The queen of control had fallen, and I stood as the rightful owner, calm, resolute, and unyielding. But even with the audit complete and the estate secured, there were whispers that Clara and Mother were plotting behind closed doors, and I knew this battle for power was far from over. It arrived 2 weeks later, tucked in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single key and a note in my father's handwriting. For Evelyn. Only you. My hands trembled as I held it, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I knew immediately where it belonged. The hidden safe in my father's private study. A place I had rarely entered, even as a caretaker, out of respect or fear of his secrets. Tonight the manor was quiet. No echoes of arguing, no rustling of post-it notes or the scent of greed. Just the stillness of a house that had finally found its rightful owner. I inserted the key and turned it slowly. The safe door creaked open, revealing bundles of documents, old letters, and a leather-bound journal. I pulled it out carefully. The first pages were filled with my father's handwriting, meticulous and deliberate. He had documented everything. The initial capital, the trust, my mother's and Clara's manipulations, and his own regrets for ever leaving me in the shadows. There were letters addressed to me, letters I had never known existed, explaining his decisions, his love, and why he trusted me above all others. Tears threatened, but I kept them at bay. For the first time in decades, the Blackwell manor felt like mine, not because of money or property, but because I understood the story behind it. Among the documents, I found a final letter marked in bold. Evelyn, my daughter, the estate, the wealth, the legacy, these are yours. Guard it, not for pride but for the truth it represents. I sat in my father's chair, holding the letter, feeling the culmination of years of pain, neglect, and betrayal transform into something unbreakable. I had survived every slight, every deception, every calculated insult. And now I held the power not for vengeance but for justice. That night I walked the halls of the manor, touching the familiar walls and furniture, smelling the air of home that had once been poisoned by greed. I realized that victory was not in the money, not in the estate, but in reclaiming my own life, my own identity. The next morning, Clara and my mother did not appear. They didn't call. They didn't send messages. The realization hit them first. Their control had ended, and no amount of scheming could undo what had been legally and morally restored. I sat on the veranda, sunlight spilling over the manicured gardens, feeling a quiet satisfaction that no storm, no slap, and no betrayal could ever take from me again. I had reclaimed everything that mattered: the truth, my father's love, my dignity, and my freedom. And though the manor was finally mine, I knew life would always have secrets waiting in the shadows, and one day, someone else might test just how far I was willing to go to protect them.